Peace and blessings, family. Peace and blessings. This is Brother Sam PK Collins. I am one fourth of PAPTV. Please forgive me for not being in the space today or over the last few weeks. It has been a busy time in my professional and personal life, but indeed, in the spirit of advancing our cause as universal African nationalists and as Pan African minded people, I have carved time out to produce this recording about what it is that I have seen over the course of the last couple of days during what is called the US Africa Leaders Summit. For those who are not aware, the US Africa Leaders Summit has pretty much shut down a good portion of Washington, D.C., from the area where it's being held at the Washington Convention Center, um, including places, portions of Metro Center and Gallery Place. So it's very tight. There's a lot of security, and that's because there are 49 African heads of state and the African Union chair who are in Washington, D.C. to meet with members of the Biden administration to discuss what the administration described as fostering and strengthening relationships between Africa and the United States. Now, it's very clear. I don't have to tell you guys why that is not accurate and why there are more nefarious intentions in mind for what the United States has planned for the African continent. We don't have to look far in history or in the present time to understand that any relationship between the United States and Africa is a paternalistic one in which Africans have their resources seized, where they are given out loans with high interest rates that paralyze them from making advances in their infrastructure, and where the United States uses African countries as a battleground to advance global hegemony and to advance its cause against China and Russia, which is definitely what's happening right now. Because if you look at the summit in context, then you will see that it's coming after uh, many of the African nations declined or just outright opposed sanctions against Russia in the aftermath of its invasion of Ukraine. And at a time when China pretty much forgave its debt-free or its interest-free loans to 17 African countries. So we're talking about a time of vast competition between these three entities, and we're talking about proxy wars that are being carried out. It is something that's reminiscent of the Cold War when the US and Russia was going at it. So the Biden administration, just like the Obama administration years before, saw it had no choice but to lighten this approach toward the African continent, because up until that time, it has been militaristic in nature in form of AFRICOM, which has U.S. military bases throughout most of the continent, and even through the toppling of African leaders and the game of musical chairs that the United States plays with African nations in terms of just positioning leaders, neoliberal puppets that can carry out the will of the United States from Africa, where people are suffering because of US imposed policies. So all of this comes into play when we're talking about the US Africa Leader Summit. And the most dangerous aspect of this is how the United States plans to engage African leaders on the continent, young African leaders on the continent, and African youth throughout the diaspora. They have done so by co-opting Pan-African language and by co-opting a mission that was set forth by our ancestors in order to unite the African diaspora. The United States decided that they will take on that mission and co-opt it by using government resources and by using youth who look like me and you to carry out that mission. They are funding education initiatives, right, through which African youth can come to the United States and boost their leadership skills in a bevy of industries. So these young people, right, are living their dreams in the United States for weeks at a time. They're gaining leadership experience and they're being integrated into the infrastructure and the leadership infrastructure at that of the United States government. So they can go back home and act as diplomats for American causes that will further US hegemony on the African continent. And we can take it even a step further by looking at who are at these meetings. The series of meetings specifically that took place at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, miles away from the actual summit that was at the convention center. So African youth sat face to face with leaders in controlled environments where they talked on panels and they got to hear about promises and the billions upon billions of dollars in investments that, from my vantage point, has little determination on how the African continent will function. Because remember, these investments will go into the hands of neoliberal leaders and in the hands of people who are controlled by institutions that puppeteer the actions of these leaders on the African continent. So, what exactly is happening at the grassroots? We are talking about closed meetings. We are talking about people who have been filtered and chosen by the elites, the so called elites, in order to carry out an agenda that has been in place since the 1950s and 60s. Okay. And once again, we're talking about the co-optation of language that was originated within the Pan-African or the African nationalist community. So we're talking about a dangerous game being played. And one more point I want to make before I sign off is that, you know, at the convention center, there were meetings, once again, bilateral, meaning between the United States government and one African country, or multilateral between the US government and different African countries. They were multilateral and bilateral meetings during which memorandums of understanding were being signed. So one example in particular concerns the Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia, both of which signed an MOU with the United States government through which the US government can continue to extract resources, cobalt, for example, that will be used to create batteries for electric vehicles. And this was a memorandum of understanding, a deal that was months in the making, but has further been solidified at the US Africa Leaders Summit. And trust and believe, there will be more on the way. This video was recorded on Tuesday. By the time you watch it on Wednesday, there'll be more deals in place during the business portion of these proceedings when we're talking about trade, we're talking about agriculture, we're talking about various aspects of commerce that the US plans to engage in with the African continent. And once again, let it be clear that it's not out of, any regard for the African continent that they're doing it. It's with the understanding that the African continent will have a substantial amount of young people in the future, and that right now the US is in competition with Russia and China for dominance, even though they don't want to talk about that. So this is a lot to keep in mind, and I'm going to pivot to solutions and wrapping up. And wrapping up, what I want to say is that we are against a machine that has resources in place to attract the best of the best, right? And to form relationships in all corners that can counter anything that we are doing, mostly because we are a people of talk and little action. We are mostly rhetorical. We have little action, which is why our counterattack has to be scientific in nature and multifaceted, and for the most part, quiet and self-sustaining. And with that, that is the charge that I give to my colleagues, all across the Pan-African world, the grassroots Pan-African world, the African nationalist world. We got to be very calculating and scientific in how we respond to this. And that goes as far as even forming relationships and conducting projects outside of the purview of these governments, because as of right now, these are not our governments. Our governments are governments of the grassroots, of the actual people, not those who are in institutions that are being funded by the powers that be. So with that, I leave you, and I request and demand that we continue to stay informed we continue to make informed decisions, we continue to make plans, and we continue to understand and understand what it is that we are up against as African people. Brother Sam PK Collins signing out. Peace and blessings, y'all.